Welcome to the 22nd episode of the God and Game Theory podcast, where we learn how to break free from the shackles of this world. Because heaven on earth can be found, and that's why we are all here to help one another in finding it. I'm your host, Tom Peterson, and it's so exciting to have you here with me today, because in this episode, I'm going to be unveiling more prophecies within the book of Revelation, the most incredible book in the entire Holy Bible. And in this episode, I'm going to be covering chapters 15 through 18. And I would stick around for this one because I'm going to also be sharing with you God's superpowers. So this video will be shedding some light on many things that have been kept in the dark. So let's get going. I'm going to go back to the last episode because there was something that I missed out on because I ended up going from Daniel back to Revelation. I couldn't find my page. So I got a little discombobulated with all that. So I forgot about one very important thing. And it does tie in with this video and what I'm going to be discussing with you today. So I want to cover this real quick. This was at the end of chapter 12, and it's in reference to the flood. So I'll just read this to you again as a refresher. And from the serpent's mouth, a vast flood of water gushed out and swept toward the woman in an effort to get rid of her. But the earth helped her by opening its mouth and swallowing the flood. So we went back to Daniel, and we determined that the flood wasn't really flood waters, but it was actually Satan and his armies coming after the Christians, after God's chosen, his protected people. And so it was many things. It was the Roman soldiers, it was the persecution, the torture, the execution. It was all of those things, executions, all of those things that the Roman Empire and, of course, Nero Caesar were utilizing to persecute the Christians at that time. But I want to talk to you a little bit about supernatural powers because we're going to be discussing those today. So let's go to Numbers 16, 31 through 34. This is a fascinating story because this goes way back to the times of Egypt when God was bringing the Israelites across through the wilderness to the promised land, and they had escaped Egypt. They had escaped their oppression there, their slavery. But something happened in the process of them journeying through the wilderness. There was actually a mutiny that took place. There were some gentlemen who decided that they should be the leaders and that Moses and Aaron should not. And so God was pretty ticked off by this. And so he was going to present them with a very harsh judgment. And I'm going to share with you what that was. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to go kind of towards the end here. But this is what it says. And the Lord said to Moses, tell the people to get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Quick, he told the people, get away from the tents of these wicked men and don't touch anything that belongs to them, lest you be included in their sins and be destroyed along with them. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the entrances of their tents with their wives and sons and little ones. And Moses said, by this you shall know that Jehovah has sent me to do all these things that I have done, for I have not done them on my own. But if the Lord does a miracle and the ground opens up and swallows them and everything that belongs to them, then they go down alive into Sheol, that's the abyss. Then you will know that these men have despised the Lord. And he had hardly finished speaking the words when the ground suddenly split open beneath them, and a great fissure swallowed them up, along with their tents and families and their friends who were standing with them, and everything they owned. So they went down into Sheol, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished. All of the people of Israel fled at their screams, fearing that the earth would swallow them too. So this reference to the earth swallowing the flood, swallowing the water. And we have been able to determine through the prophecies of Daniel that flood, that water was referring to the Romans. That certainly is something that could be much more than just a symbolic reference. It could be a very literal reference of something much more actually taking place. So I just wanted to cover that because that was very important. I didn't want to miss out on that. But we're going to get on to chapter 15. And we're going to start from the top at 15:1. And I saw in heaven another mighty pageant showing things to come. 7 angels were assigned to carry down to earth the 7 last plagues, and then at last God's anger will be finished. Spread out before me was what seemed to be an ocean of fire and glass, and on it stood all those who had been victorious over the evil creature, his statue, his mark, and number. All were holding harps of God, and they were singing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. So he's still having this vision in heaven, and he sees all of God's people who had been saved from the Great Tribulation. He sees them in heaven rejoicing and having a great time. Then I want to talk to you about this verse here. So let me read this to you, and then I'll share another verse with you that relates to this. Then I looked and saw that the Holy of Holies of the temple in heaven was thrown wide open. So what is this Holy of Holies? Let's go look and see. This is something that's discussed in the book of Hebrews, which is a book written by Paul the Apostle. I'm going to go to 10:19 through 22 and explain to you what the Holy of Holies is. And so, dear brothers, now we may walk right into the very Holy of Holies where God is, because of the blood of Jesus Christ. This is the fresh, new, life-giving way which Christ has opened up for us by tearing the curtain, his human body, to let us into the holy presence of God. Jesus Christ is the one that provided us with the freedom to enter into the Holy of Holies. But there's one more thing that must take place before they can enter into the Holy of Holies. And I'm going to start off with 15:6. Then I looked and saw, that was 5. The 7 angels who were assigned to pour out the 7 plagues then came from the temple, clothed in spotlessly white linen, with golden belts across their chests. And one of the 4 living beings handed each of them a golden flask filled with the terrible wrath of the living God, who lives forever and forever. The temple was filled with smoke from his glory and power, and no one could enter until the 7 angels had completed pouring out the 7 plagues. So these 7 plagues had to be poured out. Judgment had to be served before everyone up there in heaven could enter into the Holy of Holies. So now I'm going to go to one other thing that talks a little bit about this pouring out, because this is interesting how it connects to older prophecies and older prophets. I'm going to go to Zephaniah. This is 3:8, and this is from 600 BC. So he was prophesying this 700 years prior. Be patient, the time is coming soon. I love how he references that as soon. I love it's soon in God's eyes. When I will stand up and accuse these evil nations, for it is my decision to gather together the kingdoms of the earth and pour out my fiercest anger and wrath upon them. All the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. He's referencing all of the earth being devoured by the fire. We've spoken about the volcanoes, certainly other things. Let's see, what else did I talk about? The meteor showers, things of that nature. There's many more things to discuss in this particular forthcoming chapter and chapters. So let's go there so we can talk about these things, because there's much more to this than what we've discussed thus far. And that pretty much covers chapter 15. It's pretty short. That's the end of that. We get into 16 now. And I heard a mighty voice shouting from the temple to the 7 angels, now go your ways and empty out the 7 flasks of the wrath of God upon the earth. So here we go. Time for final judgment. Time for the wrath to be poured out. All 7 of them. So the first angel left the temple and poured out his flask over the earth, and horrible, malignant sores broke out on everyone who had the mark of the creature and was worshiping his statue. So those who had decided to worship Satan or the Antichrist or his statue, all of the above, they were marked for this particular judgment to take place. These malignant sores breaking out, this is something we have to ask the question. Is this supernatural, or is it natural? In other words, is it caused by what we would consider to be a natural disaster, or is it something more supernatural that we really can't explain? So I'm going to go back to previous example of this. This already happened once before. I'm going to go back to Exodus. And it's interesting how I'm going back to the second book in the entire Bible to see things that were very similar that had already been displayed and exercised by God. And it's all relative to the very last book in the Bible. So just incredible how these things are connected from the very front to the very back. And so there are many references to Exodus in terms of these things taking place in the past. So I'm going to go to 9:1-6. Go back to, now this is again, just for reference, this is when God is trying to get his people, the Israelites, freed from Egypt. And he is threatening Pharaoh with certain supernatural or natural disasters so that Pharaoh would let his people go. And this was just one of them. There were many. Go back to Pharaoh, the Lord commanded Moses, and tell him, Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews, demands that you let his people go to sacrifice to him. That's what they were selling to Pharaoh, is they were going to go sacrifice, but they were actually going to the promised land. If you refuse, the power of God will send you a deadly plague to destroy your cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, flocks, and herds. But the plague will affect only the cattle of Egypt. None of the Israeli herds and flocks will even be touched. The Lord announced that the plague would begin the very next day, and it did. The next morning, all the cattle of the Egyptians began dying, but not one of the Israeli herds was even sick. I mention that because there are going to be examples in here where these events did not affect God's people. They only affected the others. They only affected those who had taken the mark, those who were against God. So it's very interesting how he can utilize these events to just affect some and not others. I'm going to move on to 8. Then Jehovah said to Moses and Aaron, take ashes from the kiln, Moses. And this is very similar to the bowls and the pouring out. He says, toss it into the sky as Pharaoh watches. So that's like tossing it up into the sky from earth, where they're pouring the bowls out from above in heaven. It will spread like fine dust over all the land of Egypt and cause boils to break out upon people and animals alike throughout the land. So they took ashes from the kiln and went to Pharaoh, and as he watched, Moses tossed it toward the sky, and it became boils that broke out on men and animals alike throughout all of Egypt. And the magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils, for the boils appeared on them too. So there were many things that could cause these boils to instantaneously arrive or break out. That is a supernatural event that is proven through past scriptures that has already been done and taken place. So I'm going to go based on that assumption that this is what's taking place here in this particular verse with relation to this first flask being poured out. Let's get on to the second one. The second angel poured out his flask upon the oceans, and they became like a watery blood of a dead man, and everything in all the oceans died. So that could also be a supernatural event, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But I would also consider it to be, more than likely, since it's the oceans, a natural disaster. And the reasons why is because if we consider what would cause the water to turn red, that would be an algae bloom. And I believe I've discussed that in a prior video. But the algae bloom is something that happens, and it's not really all that uncommon. I don't know if you've been on social media. You've probably seen these videos that pop up from time to time of the red water running somewhere. And somebody says, oh boy, the water's turning red. It's the second coming of Jesus Christ. It's happening. The signs are all over. It's the water's red. So it does happen. These algae blooms happen. And the ecosystem is very fragile. So it doesn't take a whole lot for these algae blooms to happen. It's just a slight disruption. So I'm going to go over a couple things. Now, just ahead of time to let you know, physics and chemistry were never classes that I was interested in. I slept during those classes. So this is all kind of new to me, learning this stuff. It's not something I paid much attention to prior to this, but I think it's very important to discuss. So the algae blooms occur due to the presence of iron, nitrates, phosphates, and other elements. These are all contained in volcanic ash, sulfur, and magma from either above the surface or below. So think about this for a minute. If we're talking about the oceans, it's plausible that the volcano eruptions on land could cause this damage, but more than likely, it's the volcanoes that sit below the ocean floor. And just for reference, and this is just based on information that I could find, they state that there are almost 2,000 active volcanoes on land around the world today, and over 1 million of them on the ocean floor. So that could very well be a natural disaster that could take place. We have a bunch of volcanoes going off on the ocean floor, spewing out all of these chemicals that are going to be highly disruptive to the ecosystem. And these are chemicals that increase the iron. That is something that is very consistent. That's going to create the algae blooms. But there are other things to it as well. So the hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, anything that churns up the ocean floor can also cause this. Anything that's a disruption can cause this. So all of these things could certainly cause that to happen. The supernatural events I will get to next, because we're going to talk about the rivers and the waterways. But a simple change in the metabolic composition, for example, with nitrates and phosphates, would just immediately make algae blooms occur. And what happens with the death of the aquatic life is due to the metals and the toxins, and there's something called potassium thiocyanate, which causes all kinds of other issues, pH disruption and oxygen depletion, all of that. So that's what then kills off all of the sea life. So that to me seems very plausible in terms of how that could happen from a natural disaster perspective with volcanoes and other things. I'm going to go on to the third one. The third angel poured out his flask upon the rivers and springs, and they became blood. So it's the same thing happening here with the rivers and springs. I want to talk to you about a supernatural event that took place back in the past. Much like the event with the sores, let's go back to Exodus again, because God had displayed this to the Pharaoh also. And this is 7:17 through 21. And now the Lord says this, you are going to find out that I am God, for I have instructed Moses to hit the water of the Nile with his rod, and the river will turn to blood. The fish will die, and the river will stink, so that the Egyptians will be unwilling to drink it. Then the Lord instructed Moses, tell Aaron to point his rod toward the waters of Egypt. All its rivers, canals, marshes, and reservoirs, and even the water stored in bowls and pots in the homes will be turned to blood. So Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. As Pharaoh and all of his officials watched, Aaron hit the surface of the Nile with the rod, and the river turned to blood. The fish died, and the water became so foul that the Egyptians couldn't drink it. And there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. So that is a supernatural event that took place there. And how could that occur? Well, if we think about that from a perspective of energy. So God is energy. I say this all the time. Everything is energy. Electrons are energy. And so if God has the ability to control the energy, which he does, all of it, then he also has the ability to control energy that could make that happen rather quickly, pretty much by snapping your fingers, if you were him. And just to show you what I mean by this, so the energetic and molecular processes, such as iron oxidation, occurs due to the transfer of electrons, which changes the molecular structure of the iron in the water. Boom, you get algae blooms. That's all it takes. Electrons have a quantum defined position with atoms. So it's all electrons, it's all atoms, it's molecules, it's all of these things that God controls all the time, everywhere, all around us. And so for that to be a supernatural event, just based on God saying it so, that could and would certainly take place. Okay, so let's get moving on. There's more of this to come, and they just keep getting better. So I'm going to move on now to the fourth flask. This is, let me make sure I've got the correct, this is 16 8 through 9. Okay, so we're skipping up here just a little bit. I'm skipping a few things that aren't relative. This is 8. Then the fourth angel poured out his flask upon the sun, causing it to scorch all men with its fire. Everyone was burned by this blast of heat, and they cursed the name of God who sent the plagues. They did not change their mind and attitude to give him glory, however. So this pouring out of the flask upon the sun, causing it to scorch all men with its fire. Going back to energy, supernatural event, God controls the sun, God created the sun. He could certainly make the sun do a lot of things in terms of increasing energy, increasing UV radiation, all of those things he could certainly do. But I would like to talk to you about one other event that I'm now familiar with. I wasn't before, but something called cosmic airbursts. You may or may not have heard of these. And you might be saying to yourself, oh boy, this kind of sounds like, the made up stuff that NASA comes up with. I would have thought the same, except there's a ton of historical evidence in relation to these events actually having taken place in the past. So I'm just going to tell you what I've been able to find on this. When a meteorite explodes violently before reaching the ground, that is a cosmic airburst. It's a massive release of kinetic energy. Moving electrons carry kinetic energy. So this is all energy-related stuff. Here's an example. This is the Tunguska event in Siberia. They date it as 1908, but it had kinetic energy equal to that of 10 to 30 megatons of TNT, roughly 1,000 times the energy of the Hiroshima bomb. We're talking extreme amounts of energy. It flattened out 80 million trees, ignited fires, produced winds equal to that of a tornado. One more example. The destruction of Tal el-Hammam, I think I pronounced that right. This is near the Dead Sea, so it's very interesting the location of this. Intense, and again, the date on this, don't know what it is in actual dates, but it was intense thermal radiation, which is consistent with all of these events. They all have intense thermal radiation, creating flash burns of the first, second, and third degree, which caused blisters, peeling, and horrific pain. Those symptoms were all recorded from these events that have taken place. There were some in Russia that took place more recent in history in the 1900s, if I'm not mistaken. But huge kinetic energy events. So that's something, again, just to be thinking about in terms of what God has in terms of his superpowers that can be utilized for all of these events to take place in the process of burning up the earth and creating all of these disastrously, horrible things for these people who continued to resist him. So now we're going to move on to the fifth angel. He poured out his flask upon the throne of the creature from the sea, that's Satan, and his kingdom, which is the Roman Empire, which was plunged into darkness, and his subjects gnawed their tongues in anguish and cursed the God of heaven for their pains and sores, but they refused to repent of all their evil deeds. So I read this, and I see the darkness, which would be something similar to the abyss. That would be the Sheol or Hades, this dark place where you're left to wait until your day of judgment before you get thrown into the lake of fire. So that's what I see as the darkness. And obviously their kingdom was being destroyed. It was over for them. And this thing about gnawing their tongues, that's also very interesting, because when you see scriptures related to hell, gnashing of the teeth is something that is described in relation to hell. So the gnawing of the tongues could be the abyss, which is preliminary to the gnashing of teeth in the lake of fire. So just something to think about in terms of how this is written and what it's describing here in terms of the darkness, because we're going to be covering that more in the next episode. Okay, so I'm going to move on. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything on that one. Then I'll move on to the sixth. Yeah, this has some good stuff. Okay, this is where it starts to get really, really good, because there's a lot of stuff to figure out here. So this is 12. The sixth angel poured out his flask upon the great river Euphrates, and it dried up so that the kings from the east could march their armies westward without hindrance. I'm going to stop there because this is something that's really interesting, and it took me a while to figure this out. Because I've been led to believe, or had been, the understanding was that the kings that he was freeing up here were Satan's armies. Because that's what, if you go online, you ask AI any of these things, it's going to tell you, at least that's what I found, it'll tell you that it's Satan's armies that crossed. I disagree. I don't believe it was Satan's armies at all. I believe it was God's armies that crossed, and God dried the river so that his armies could cross. Because we have a tremendous number of examples of God doing this in the past for his armies to cross, not for Satan's. So I'm going to go to some of those examples real quick. I'm going to go back to Joshua. This is 4:19 through 24. And Joshua was the one that was left to lead the Israelites to the promised land, because Moses had done some things that God wasn't very happy about, Aaron too. So they were not able to, they were both put to death before getting to the promised land, and Joshua was the one left in charge to do that. And this is what God had done for Joshua to help them get there. This miracle occurred on the 25th of March. That day the entire nation crossed the Jordan River, this is the Israelites, and camped in Gilgal at the eastern edge of the city of Jericho. And there the 12 stones from the Jordan were piled up as a monument. So there were 12 stones that they piled up, and the 12 stones, I imagine, were there to be symbolic of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then Joshua explained again the purpose of the stones. Get this. In the future, he said, when your children ask you why these stones are here and what they mean, you are to tell them that these stones are a reminder of this amazing miracle, that the nation of Israel crossed the Jordan River on dry ground. Tell them how the Lord our God dried up the river right before our eyes and then kept it dry until we were all across. It is the same thing the Lord did 40 years ago at the Red Sea. He did this so that all the nations of the earth will realize that Jehovah is the mighty God, and so that all of you will worship him forever. So that's one example, and there's more. I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about who the armies are from the east that God is helping to cross. And we're going to go back to Isaiah 41, 2 through 4, because this is something that had been discussed previously, and this is something that had been done previously. Who has stirred up this one from the east, whom victory meets at every step? This is very interesting because God is speaking in terms of the third person here. He's kind of going in and out of the third person to describe himself, but he's also describing this person that he is putting in charge of going east, or who's from the east going west. I'll start over. Who has stirred up this one from the east, whom victory meets at every step? Who indeed but the Lord? God has given him victory over many nations and permitted him to trample kings underfoot and to put entire armies to the sword. He chases them away and goes on safely. Through the paths he treads are new, though the paths he treads are new. Who has done such mighty deeds, directing the affairs of generations of mankind as they march by? It is I, the Lord, the first and last. I alone am he. So he is saying that he has a tremendous amount of involvement. He's the one that's been behind these prior events with these kings, or this king crossing from the east to the west to essentially get rid of the other kings, to destroy them and to take over whatever it is. Well, let's get to that. Whatever it is that he's been told to do. So we're going to get to Isaiah 44, 26 through 28. Because God has instructed these men, or this man, to do these things. Let me see, 44, 26 through 28. I'm on 46. There we go. Okay, but what my prophets say, I do. This is God speaking again. He's speaking to Isaiah the prophet. But what my prophets say, I do. When they say Jerusalem will be delivered and the cities of Judah lived in once again, it shall be done. When I speak to the rivers and say, be dry, they shall be dry. When I say of Cyrus, here we go, he is my shepherd. He will certainly do as I say. This is referring to Cyrus. I'm going to read just one more. 44, this is 26 through 28, and then we're going to do 45, 1 through 6. This is Jehovah's message to Cyrus, God's anointed, whom he has chosen to conquer many lands. God shall empower his right hand, and he shall crush the strength of mighty kings. God shall open the gates of Babylon to him. The gates shall not be shut against him any more. I will go before you, Cyrus, and level the mountains. Now that is in reference to volcanoes, leveling mountains, which is something I don't know if I've explained before, but it doesn't happen all the time. But there are instances where volcanoes, after they erupt, because of the magma flow, the lava flow and everything, it essentially ends up flattening out because the mountain itself is eroded from all of the damage. And smash down the city gates of brass and iron bars. And I will give you treasures hidden in the darkness, secret riches, and you will know that I am doing this. That's going to come up in the next video, so just remember that. I, the Lord, the God of Israel, the one who calls you by your name. And why have I named you for this work? For the sake of Jacob, my servant, Israel, my chosen ones. So here he's talking about how he's going to go ahead of Cyrus, clear the way, clear the path for Cyrus. And when Cyrus went and took over Babylon from the Assyrians, it was over fast. I mean, there was very little resistance that took place. And that's what he's referring to here, this particular story. He's referring to when he sent Cyrus to go take over Babylon and take these Assyrians out of there to destroy and overcome the Assyrians in the process. And it was a very simple and easy victory. And the other thing that's very interesting to point out is if you go back in history and you see the strategy behind this victory, they say a lot of the strategy had to do with him being able to cross over the Euphrates, that he had redirected the water in some way and made it dry. Somehow, some way he was able to get his forces over the Euphrates, and this was a strategic thing that took place that allowed him to win this battle very easily and very simply. So I'm just mentioning that because we have history that continues to repeat itself time and time again. That's what we're seeing here. So one thing I want to make sure I don't forget, let's talk about who these people are, because we know that Cyrus was way back when. That was back 400, 500 years ago when that took place with Cyrus. And then we really didn't hear about the Persians a whole lot more after that. But this is what took place between then and now. The Persian Empire became the Parthian Empire, or the Abbasid Empire. It ruled across Mesopotamia and beyond. And it just so happens it was Rome's primary eastern rival and very powerful. Both were considered the superpowers of that time. It was Rome's most dangerous and persistent adversary, and the very one who prevented Rome's expansion to the east. So the Parthian Empire was the new version of the Persian Empire, which was incredibly powerful and incredibly strong. And because of that, the Roman Empire was not able to move any further east. There was a stalemate, essentially at the Euphrates, because the Parthian Empire was so incredibly powerful and strong. And there were historical battles that took place where the Romans, they fought back and forth quite a bit. So this was not a new thing, except that God now chose this empire, much like he did before, to come across the Euphrates to join him in his battle, which comes up next, which is the Battle of Armageddon. So those are the armies that he chose. And again, I'm sure they were lying in wait for this particular moment in time and readied for this moment in time so that they could take on the Roman Empire alongside Jesus Christ. Now, let me make sure I don't get lost where I'm at here. So that was 1612. I'm going to go a little bit further now. I don't know how I got back a page, but I did. Okay, let's get back up here. Okay, now we get into what Satan did in his armies. And I saw 3 evil spirits disguised as frogs leap from the mouth of the dragon, the creature, and the false prophet. So Satan himself, the Antichrist himself, Nero Caesar, and the false prophet. These demons, which are referenced as frogs, which at the time were considered really unclean. That's why God chose to use them in one of the plagues. Going back to Exodus again, there was another plague. I won't read it to you, but there was another plague in Exodus where God unleashed the frogs. And Pharaoh couldn't deal with the frogs because they were everywhere. So I believe, from what I understand, they were considered to be unclean. So maybe that's the reference here in terms of the symbolism of these unclean spirits. But these were unclean spirits. And what they did is these miracle-working demons conferred. That would be to award. So there's some reference to deceit going on here. They conferred with all the rulers of the world to gather them for battle against the Lord on that great coming judgment day of the God Almighty. So somehow, some way, they convinced all of those that were part of the Roman Empire, all of those armies, because the Roman Empire, remember, they used all of the armies from all of their other provinces to fight their battles. That's how they were so successful. They didn't necessarily lose their own people. They used everybody else's. And that was kind of their agenda, was to have men from other countries fight their battles for them. And so that's very interesting. We've seen a lot of that, obviously, over the years, during the time we've been in this little season. But the interesting thing about this is that these armies that were convinced to go to battle essentially signed a death wish, but they did it anyways, and they gathered all of the armies of the world, this is 16, near a place called, in Hebrew, Armageddon, the mountain of Medigo. So that's what they did. And then the 7th angel poured out his flask into the air, and a mighty shout came from the throne of the temple in heaven, saying, "It is finished." It was done. It was over that quickly. And again, these are things that take place when God is leading the armies and the soldiers and so on and so forth. And I want to make sure I mention this because this is going to be coming up in the next video. But I do want to talk about how God utilizes the armies of men to help fight these battles. It's not as though Jesus just shows up on a white horse with a sword in his mouth and he slays everybody one at a time with his sword. This, if you look at biblical history, you look at what's gone on time and time and time again. We can go back to Gideon, for example. He came after Joshua. He had an army of 30,000. He was going to fight the Midianites. They had an army of 130,000. And God said, "You have too many men. You got to get it down, whittle it down to 300. Because if you have 30,000, people aren't going to realize that I was the one that brought you to victory." So they whittled the army down to 300 soldiers against 130,000. And they just desolate them. They just tore them to shreds. And it's because, again, God was leading ahead of that army. And he is the one that brought them the victory. And the same thing is happening today. I'm not going to go into that now. That I'll save for the next video. But I do want to frame that so it's something that you keep in mind as we continue to discuss these battles that take place, because there is another one that's also incredibly fascinating. I don't want to get too far off course here. Let's get back to 16 through 17. I did, so let's go to 18 to 19, which is a great earthquake. Then, this is 18. Then the thunder crashed and rolled, and lightning flashed, and there was a great earthquake of a magnitude unprecedented in human history. The great city of Babylon split into 3 sections, and cities around the world fell in heaps of rubble. So all of Babylon's sins were remembered in God's thoughts, and she was punished to the last drop of anger in the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. I want to talk about Luke 21:5-6 real quick before I go any further, because this is something that Jesus spoke about, and he made it very clear exactly what was going to happen, and it did. But Jesus said, "The time is coming when all these things you are admiring," he was referring to the temples and the buildings and such in Jerusalem. "The time is coming when all these things you are admiring will be knocked down, and not one stone will be left on top of another." all will become one vast heap of rubble. And he was referring to this event taking place. And if we look at this event, this great earthquake of a magnitude unprecedented in human history, my personal belief is this is the earthquake that divided the continents. If you look at old maps, well, look, again, the maps are tough, but I will just say based on my own prior experience and observations, the old maps show the continents connected. The new maps show them no longer connected. There's a vast difference between the maps. And I know that our new maps may not even be realistic. They may not even be what things actually look like. That I'm well aware of. But there was, in my opinion, a great earthquake that took place that separated the continents. That is the earthquake that I believe he's referring to here. There is also something that I want to mention to you. I want to make sure I don't forget this. Well, I'll get to that. I'll get to that here at the end. That's a supervolcano. That's not an earthquake. Okay, I'll get to that towards the end. Okay, so let's move on to Revelation 16, 20 through 21 and finish up this chapter. Those are my thoughts on the earthquake. And islands vanished, and mountains flattened out, and there was an incredible hailstorm from heaven. Hailstones weighing 100 pounds fell from the sky onto the people below. So beyond the earthquake, we have islands vanishing. And what would cause islands to vanish? Well, tsunamis could certainly do that because the water levels rise, get very high, become very destructive, could certainly wash islands away. If the water levels rise permanently, that could make them just flat out disappear. So I would say that there are a lot of natural disasters that could take place in order for that to happen. Then you also have the huge hailstones. This is in reference to the firestones. And some of these are huge. They're massive. I have let's see what scripture that is. I'm going to go to Isaiah 30:30 because this is something that describes the size of these hailstones, which are the projectiles from the volcanoes. Oh, where is that? Here it is. And the Lord shall cause his majestic voice to be heard and shall crush down his mighty arm upon his enemies with angry indignation. And the devouring flames and tornadoes and terrible storms and huge hailstones. So this is referring to huge hailstones, devouring flames, as well as tornadoes and terrible storms. So all of these things that we're coming across in the book of Revelation are prophesied here hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before in terms of what was going to take place. So I'm going to move on from that. Let's get on to, I think we're on to 17 now. Oh, one more thing I wanted to share. Let's go back to Genesis. Because this describes the flaming tar from the sky, which is also another interesting reference. This is 1924. This is the first book of the Bible. Then the Lord rained down fire and flaming tar from heaven upon Sodom and Gomorrah. So it happened then when these firestones came down to Sodom and Gomorrah and utterly destroyed them along with the other cities and villages of the plain, eliminating all life, people, plants, and animals alike. Blew everything out. And my understanding is you can go back to the site of Sodom and Gomorrah, and you can find sulfur balls in the dirt. Apparently, about hundreds of thousands of them, these sulfur balls in the dirt. Well, where would sulfur balls come from? Volcanic eruptions. So that's just one more thing to reference these superpowers and these natural disasters created by God in the process of his judgment and wrath upon the people. Let's move on to 17. We are on the last chapter, and we have a couple wild things to cover in this one. And I do want to talk to you real quick about a supervolcano, since we're on the subject of volcanoes. I haven't spoken of supervolcanoes before. I've spoken of volcanoes, but there is something called a supervolcano. And there's one historically that you can look up, and I'm not going to get too deep into it, but it's called the Toba supervolcano. They say it happened way, way, way back eons ago. It's very possible that it happened during this time, and they just don't want us to put the pieces together based on the dates, which was something they love to do. The energy released, the kinetic energy from this supervolcano was 1,000 times greater than that of Mount St. Helens. So if you can imagine Mount St. Helens times 1,000, that's the amount of energy that was released from this supervolcano. It is called Toba. You can look it up. It's fascinating. Okay, I'm going to get on to 17:1. Let's continue. One of the 7 angels who had poured out the plagues came over and talked with me. Come with me, he said, and I will show you what is going to happen to the notorious prostitute who sits upon the many waters of the world. The kings of the world have had immoral relations with her, and the people of the earth have been made drunk by the wine of her immortality. I'm going to keep going. So the angel took me in spirit into the wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet animal that had 7 heads and 10 horns, written all over with blasphemies against God. The woman wore purple and scarlet clothing and beautiful jewelry made of gold and precious gems and pearls, and held in her hand a golden goblet full of obscenities. A mysterious caption was written on her forehead: Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of idol worship everywhere around the world. I could see that she was drunk with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus she had killed. I stared at her in horror. Make sure, I'm going to go one more. Why are you so surprised? The angel asked. I'll tell you who she is and what the animal she is riding represents. Well, I can go forward into 17, let's just see. Yeah, 17, 18. And I can tell you, it says right here who she is. And this woman you saw in your vision represents the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So he's referring to Rome. So Rome is the woman sitting on top of the beast, the hybrid beast. This is not the same beast as these other beasts that we've seen before in this book. This is a different beast. It's called a hybrid beast. That's what I call it anyways, and I'll explain to you the reasons why. So you have Rome sitting on top. Well, what is the rest of it then? Well, let's go and find out, because there's something here to share with us. And these are the hints. And I just want to make sure that I'm not missing something else here before we go there. Okay, before I get into 9, let's read 8. He was alive, but isn't now. And yet soon he will come up out of the bottomless pit, that's Satan, and go to eternal destruction. And the people of earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life before the world began, will be dumbfounded at his reappearance after being dead. I used to read this verse and be so incredibly perplexed because I could not figure out what on earth this was. So I finally went to the 1560 Geneva Bible because there were things in here that were throwing me off a little bit, and I knew that something wasn't quite right about this. So I went to the 1560 Geneva, and I'll share with you what I found. The interesting thing about the timing of this beast reads like this. And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have yet, let me make sure I'm not going ahead here. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm cutting ahead. Hang on. We're not there yet. Let's keep going. I apologize. Then we'll get into the conversation. Let's do that. And now think hard. The 7 heads represent a certain city built on 7 hills where this woman has her residence. They also represent 7 kings. 5 have already fallen, the 6th now reigns, and the 7th is yet to come. But his reign will be brief. The scarlet animal that died is the 8th king, having reigned before as one of the 7. After his 2nd reign, he too will go to his doom. So there's a lot going on here. So let's break this down. First, we know that she, the woman, is Rome. We know that what she's sitting on top of is the Roman Empire. Okay, and I want to make sure that I've got that right. If we look at the 7 heads, that's representing the city built on the 7 hills. That's Rome. We know that. But those 7 heads also represent 7 kings. These are the kings of the Roman Empire. So the 5 that have already fallen were the prior Caesars. The 6th that now reigns is Nero Caesar. The 7th is yet to come, which will be another one that will reign shortly after Nero Caesar, before the millennial reign comes. His time is very short because once the millennial reign came, the Roman Empire was gone, he was gone. Then it says, the scarlet animal that died is the 8th king, having reigned before as one of the 7. Well, why does it say that? Because he was one of the 7, because he was also the 6th. Because remember, Nero Caesar was Satan incarnate. So Satan was also the 6th king. But he comes back as the 8th. That's his second reign. And then it says he too will go to his doom. So let's get a little bit more information on that from the Geneva Bible of 1560. It says, the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings which have not yet received a kingdom. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go here. I apologize. That's next. Okay, the Bible says, the Geneva says, he was, in terms of the beast, which this particular translation of the Bible does not. There are some translations of the Bible that use the was, is not, and yet is. My version does not. This is the Living Bible, it does not. But the Geneva says he was. It's referring to the beast's original form, which is the emperors, the Caesars. That is the Roman Empire, the beast in its original form. Then it says is not, because that beast was destroyed by God and his armies prior to the millennial reign. So the Roman Empire was destroyed prior to the millennial reign, gone. Then came back after the millennial reign was over for Satan's little season. That's why it said yet is. So it was telling us at that time that in the future, the Roman Empire would come back, but in a different form. What is that form? The Vatican. A new manifestation that will rise during Satan's little season. So that's how Satan has become so sneaky, because the Roman Empire was obliterated and went away during the millennial reign. But once Satan's little season came into play and became part of our time here on earth, the Vatican came back as the new Roman Empire. And it wasn't just the Vatican. It was a 3-headed monster, so to speak, because you then have the Vatican, which is the religious component. You have the Bank of London, which is the banking component, the home office. Look, think of these as home offices for Satan, for the Roman Empire to do the work. Again, the central banks connected to London, religion connected to the Vatican, the military connected to Washington, D.C. That was the 3-headed monster. And then, of course, other home offices in other places, such as Israel and several more other places where home offices had been set up by Satan to then have all of these various empires, not Roman empires, but empires throughout the world, very much trying to do the same thing, but doing it in a very different way, very deceitful way. So it wasn't obvious to us what he was really doing and what he was really up to, because he had spread it out through different continents and countries throughout the world. But he came back, and that's how it all happened, and that's what we're dealing with now. So I just want to make sure I mention that to you, because now that I go back and read this, it makes more sense, because he was alive before the millennial reign, or before he was destroyed, because it says, but isn't now, because he had been destroyed at that point. Yet soon will come out of the bottomless pit, because remember, he was in the bottomless pit during the millennial reign, to go to eternal destruction, which is what he's been doing ever since he was released from the bottomless pit during Satan's little season. And then this reference to the names not being written in the book of life, I want to make sure I go to that real quick and just describe to you. Well, let me make sure. I don't think I have anything in there on this one for that. Yeah, maybe I don't. Okay. So I'm just going to talk to you real quick about the names written in the book of life. We talked about that in the last video, so you can reference that. But I believe what it's saying here is those who aren't aware of this, who have their names written in the book of life, will certainly become aware of it in due time. So I just want to make sure I put everybody at ease. I'm sure that God's plan is those who that aren't aware of it and can't see it yet will see it in due time. And I imagine that's something that's going to be coming out in the near future, in a very big way, so that people can be aware of what's going on in terms of these home offices that Satan has placed throughout the world. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to the next portion of this, which is the kings, the 10 kings, the 10 horns. Okay, let's move on because we already covered the heads. So remember, the heads represent the kings that have fallen. Now we move on to the 10 horns. These 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet risen to power. Let me just make sure I've got this right. Make sure I've got this right. 7 heads. Yes, okay. Now we're going to go on to 12. His 10 horns are 10 kings who have not yet risen to power. They were not part of the Roman Empire. They will be appointed to their kingdoms for one brief moment to reign with him. So there were 10 kingdoms or 10 nations that were appointed to reign with the Roman Empire for a very short period of time. They will all sign a treaty giving their power and strength to him, to the hybrid beast, to the Roman Empire. Together they will wage war against the Lamb, against Jesus Christ. And the Lamb will conquer them. For he is the Lord over all lords and the King of kings. And his people are called and chosen and faithful ones. So this is incredibly interesting here, what it's saying, because if I go to the Geneva for this description, it gives me a little bit more information on who these 10 kings are. The 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings which yet have not received a kingdom, but shall receive power as kings at 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind. They were unified. So they were allies. They shall give their power and authority unto the beast. So they signed something to give their power and authority to the Roman Empire. And then it says, these kings shall fight with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. It doesn't say he destroyed them. It says conquered in my Bible, and it says overcome in the Geneva. Because he did not destroy them, he overcame them. And then it says, for he is the Lord of lords, the King of kings, and they that are on his side, called and chosen and faithful. So they ended up siding with Jesus Christ to work for him, even though they originally signed on to fight against him. But this was all part of God's amazing plan. And he said unto me, the waters which thou sawest, oh, that's something else. Okay, so I'm not going to go there yet. But it says here, the 10 horns, let me see, are either desolate, naked. Okay, so what happens now is these 10 kings, these 10 nations, 10 kingdoms, fight alongside God. They switched sides. They pulled a fast one. They signed with the Roman Empire, then they flipped. And they flipped to do something very specific. God had something planned for them, and this is what they are going to carry out and do. The scarlet animal and his 10 horns, which represent 10 kings who will reign with him. I just talked about them. They all hate the woman. They hated Rome and will attack her and leave her naked and ravaged by fire. For God will put a plan into their minds, a plan that will carry out his purposes. They will mutually agree to give their authority to the scarlet animal so that the words of God will be fulfilled. So they pulled a fast one, and God had this planned out so that they would impress upon the Roman Empire that they were going to fight alongside them, and then they switched sides and they destroyed Rome. These are the ones that God appointed to destroy the city. I'm going to go back to who these armies were. And this is going to be back to Jeremiah 50, 41 through 42. Jeremiah. Where am I? Hang on a second. Yeah. I'm in the Z's. I get confused between those. Okay, we're in Jeremiah 50, 41 through 42. See them coming, a great army from the north. Again, this was prophesied way, way back. This was all planned out long ago. See them coming, a great army from the north. It is accompanied by many kings called by God from many lands. They came from many lands. They are fully armed for slaughter. They are cruel and show no mercy. Their battle cry roars like the surf against the shoreline. That leads me to believe they showed up in boats. O Babylon, they ride against you, fully ready for battle. That goes way, way back, that God already had this all planned out. We're going to go now to one more, which is Isaiah 13, 1 through 5. This is the vision God showed Isaiah concerning Babylon's doom, which means Rome. See the flags waving as their enemy attacks. Shout to them, O Israel, and wave them on as they march against Babylon to destroy the palaces of the rich and mighty. I, the Lord, have set apart these armies for this task. I have called those rejoicing in their strength to do his work, to satisfy my anger. Hear the tumult on the mountains. Listen as the armies march. It is the tumult and the shout of many nations. The Lord of hosts has brought them here from countries far away. They are his weapons against you, O Babylon. They carry his anger with them and will destroy your whole land. So who are these armies from the north? Well, I would consider them to be Transalpine or Northern European forces, based on what's described in the Bible here. So this could be armies from Switzerland, Austria, Germany, and even Scandinavia, which we would consider to be the Vikings. And this type of thing that God had them do sounds like the thing that would be just perfect for those who were like that in the way that they fought, those who fought like the Vikings did, to go into cities and towns and what have you and destroy them. They had certain ways in which they fought, and they had certain gifts and strategies that they used, and they were very successful in doing this sort of thing. And this is exactly what God had them set out to do. So he chose a very specific army or kings with their armies to carry out this very specific task, along with the armies from the east to carry out another specific task. So really fascinating when you think about what God does in the utilization of these armies to fight these battles against the evildoers, against Satan and his armies. God has his own armies too, and they're out there fighting these battles for us right now as I speak, and I'll be sharing that more with you next week. Something else I just wanted to mention. This is very interesting because the marginal notes in the Geneva 1560, there is one particular version of the Geneva 1560 that has marginal notes. It's a little bit more difficult to read than the other versions, but this is interesting. I just want to point this out. This interpretation of the Geneva 1560 fueled Protestant resistance to Catholicism in the Reformation era, portraying the papacy as doomed by divine judgment through secular powers it once controlled. The notes were so pointedly anti-papal, I think that's right, that they contributed to tensions, which later influenced the King James Version to avoid such notes. And isn't that interesting? That's something you can just be thinking about and maybe look into. So that's it for this one. I can't wait for the next one. The next one's going to be even better as we get closer to the end of this book and closer to the current timeline as well as future events. But I'm pointing all of this out because these events that have taken place in the past, what God has done in the past, is very consistent with what he's going to be doing in the present day and the future, because he's very consistent in what he does and how he goes about doing these things. You can see it time and time again throughout biblical history. So just be thinking about that until we get to the next one. We'll be covering more of this at that time. So thanks for being here. Appreciate you all. Be wise. God bless. Take care. I will see you all very soon.